I was 17 when me and my buddies first went out to Okanagan Lake. For those who want to know more about this beautiful place, there is always Google, but you should know it's a gorgeous lake that's based out of Canada and is pretty long like a river. I think it stretches a couple hundred miles while being about 5 miles wide. It's a pretty good sized lake, and getting out onto a boat with my friends was my only focus for that day. This was back in 2002. My friend and a couple of our mutual friends and his dad were here at the lake with his boat. We were going to go out onto the lake and do some fishing and just enjoying being out on the water. We even brought inner tubes. We were ready to kick it. We got out onto the lake and were quite a ways out from shore. I remember there being quite a few other boats out there on the lake this day, since it was so nice. This was a hot summer day. The sky was clear. It was probably early afternoon. I think one of my friends brought out an inner tube once we had anchored, and he's sitting in it already relaxing. Now, this is tied to the boat, so it's stretched out a little ways, like maybe 30 feet from the boat. Anyway, my friend's dad is fishing. A couple of our friends are just hanging and talking, and I decided to join my friend with another inner tube. I get in it and float out to by where he is. Him and I are joking around and talking when I see movement to my left that catches my eye. I look over to my left and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Then, like out of a horror movie, I see a larger eye peering up at me from under the water, and could faintly see it belong to something really big. I began freaking out and actually fell out of my inner tube. Panicked, I frantically swam back to the boat. I guess my friend had already seen it by the time I'd fallen in the water and was already back on the boat helping me in. My friend's dad and other friends were curious at what we saw, and we both said there was something huge swimming around underneath us. My friend's dad tried calming us down, convincing us it was probably just a sturgeon coming up to the surface. Just then, we saw what looked to be a huge serpent-like body rise up slowly out of the water, about 20 feet away from the boat. It didn't raise up anything like a serpent head. This thing was swimming, and part of its body stuck out of the water. It was headed away from our boat, but whatever part of this thing's body was huge. It was scaly and dark brown and green. It reminded me of a huge sea serpent or something. We never saw the head, just the eye. The eye was probably as big as my torso, easily. The body of this thing had to be at least 10 feet in width, and who knows how long it probably actually was. It scared the shit out of us both, but we were pretty convinced we just saw a lake monster. I guess you never really know what's lurking below in the water. I guess Lake Okanagan has giant sea serpents that live in it. No thank you. This occurred just 5 years ago, last June, when I was sitting on the beach of the Columbia River. The Columbia River extends from the Pacific Ocean all the way inwards, far into the Pacific Northwest. The Columbia River is actually kind of responsible for separating Oregon and Washington State. It's a pretty huge river, and there's a lot of larger boats that go through it. It leads all the way out to the coast and into the ocean. On this day, I was sitting on the Oregon side of the beach, enjoying the scenery. It was a beautiful day out in late spring, and it was sunny and clear. I was sitting there with a couple of my bros, and we were just hanging out, talking, when one of my friends points over in the water and says, "What's that?" Confused, I looked over at what he was looking at, and out in the water is this huge serpent-like thing swimming around. Have you ever seen those old 1500 drawings where they show this sea serpent-like creature with its body in and out of the water, kind of like a spiral-like shape? I really don't know how else to describe it, but that's exactly what this thing looked like. I couldn't really get specifics on the face since it was too far out on the water, and I couldn't really make out color either. It just looked dark. Whatever it was had to be of considerable size. I can only imagine how big it was if you were to be right next to it. It wasn't at all hidden. If you were to look out even on top of the bridge where the highway runs and look out, you'd be able to see it clear as day. Me and my friends weren't scared, but we were definitely intrigued that we saw some sort of unknown creature swimming up the Columbia River. As surprising as it was to see something like this, I guess I shouldn't be surprised since the ocean leads right into this river. It would be very possible for some undiscovered species to travel without ever being noticed. Hello, I wanted to send this in to you because I thought it would make for an interesting experience that I had out in Alaska while on a fishing boat. To give you a little bit more, you get paid really good money to go out on a fishing boat for anywhere between 4 to 6 months out of the year, and you're literally spending all the time on a boat. You're sweaty, you're tired, you're hungry, but it's good suffering. It's just you and a bunch of other dudes at sea. I remember it was wintertime, and we were out off the coast somewhere closer to Alaska fishing. I was on deck at the time, and something really large hit our boat from underneath. It hit us so hard that the entire boat shook violently, and I think most of us fell over. This caused momentary chaos within the boat, and we all thought it could have been a whale. Not even a moment later, it hit the boat on the side and nearly capsized us with the amount of sheer force it hit us with. Scrambling to get to our feet and find out what was underneath our boat, about 30 or so yards away from the boat, this massive, what I can only describe as an alligator crossed with a dinosaur-looking head, pops up out of the water and looks right at our ship. This thing's head was huge. The head had to easily have been the size of a whale's head, if not larger. It just kept eye contact with us for a moment, and then, without breaking eye contact, submerged fully in the water, and we didn't see it after that. Most of the crew shared mixed emotions of awe and sheer terror at whatever we just saw come out of the water. I'm not sure what it was personally, but much of my crewmates were convinced it had to be some kind of dinosaur. I mean, I couldn't disagree. If dinosaurs were to have existed in modern day, this thing looked like it could have played the part. Since it was broad daylight, I remember that it had unique color patterns of green and dark blue on its head, and it had massive, sharpened yellow teeth that stuck out of both jaw and the top of its mouth. It looked very similar to a crocodile, but much more dinosaur-like, and more fierce, if that makes any sense. If you think about it, we only saw the head, and I have no idea what the body looked like, nor do I think I want to know. I'm glad none of us fell overboard, or that the ship did not capsize. We would have all been that thing's lunch. Spent the summer in Michigan about 7 or so years ago, since my mother had moved there after my father had passed away. Her sisters and mother lived there, and so she wanted an emotional support system. I can't say I blame her. Ever since going after college, we haven't been able to maintain as close as a relationship as I'd like. I know that has been really hard on her, so that is why I came to visit her and spend some time with her. Her and I really enjoyed to go outdoors and hike and be out in nature. I feel like for her, it was extremely therapeutic and helped her through the grieving process. However, there was one event that happened that summer that put a damper on things. It was early September at the time, and we were hanging out on Lake Dewey. Literally, out of nowhere, we see this massive, red, hairy thing just casually walk right out of the lake and into the woods. This thing was massive. It looked like a log with legs, basically. We didn't see any features other than just a huge bramble of red hair. The best description I can give you is Cousin It from the Addams Family. It was literally just a bunch of red soaking wet hair on what looked to be a huge, hairy man something. My mother and I were very unnerved by the whole thing and decided to leave, and we haven't gone back. I guess other people have talked about the Lake Dewey monster, while some apparently report seeing werewolf-like features, while others report giant ape-like features. We didn't get to see its face, or even a side profile for that matter, so we couldn't really tell you. To be honest with you though, we didn't need to. I saw enough, and anything that's 10 feet tall and climbs right out of a lake no problem is something I don't want to be anywhere near. This happened to me back in '95. I was hunting deep in the Ozarks, and I was on day 3. To give you a little insight to my situation, I would frequently go throughout the year on hunting and hiking trips into the Ozarks or whatever nearby mountains and forests I could. I did enjoy hunting, but I liked the aspect of being out in nature and hiking almost more than anything else. Hunting was just a plus. Let's see, this would have made it spring of '95 to be exact. I think it was around April or May because it was wet, but the frost of winter was gone. I hadn't encountered anything strange or bizarre on my trip, and I usually never do. This particular time that was a little different though. Everything is pretty normal until my hike led me to a small lake in the middle of nowhere. It seemed fairly peaceful since I was surrounded by the mountains and the wilderness. This lake was roughly the size of a football field. I decided now would be a good time to sit down, take a breather, and probably eat something. After shoveling a granola bar in my mouth and sitting there for some time, I began to hear bubbling and splashing from the other side of the lake. Within seconds, this green, scaly lizard-looking thing climbs out of the water and onto the shore. Then, it stands up on two legs and casually walks into the forest. I'm sitting there with a mouthful of granola bar, frozen at what I just witnessed. I thought I was somehow tripping balls and maybe had somehow hallucinated the whole thing. I didn't believe what I saw, so I got up to the area where this thing had gone and checked out the mud, and sure enough, there were huge lizard-like footprints that were bipedal in the mud, as well as claw marks where this thing had pulled itself out of the lake. Once I saw those tracks in the mud, I went pale and started sweating. There's no way something like that could be living in a lake. I left the area but continued my stay in the Ozarks quite some time and never encountered such a creature. I never got to see the face, but I saw that it was pretty large. If I had to guess, I would say around 7 feet tall. It was dark green on its back and head, but it looked like it got lighter the closer to the front of its body you got. Now that I think about it, it's kind of spooky that this thing looked like a lot like the Argonians. If any of you have ever played Skyrim, this thing looked really similar to an Argonian from behind. Maybe it was a lizard person. Maybe it was a lake monster. I told a couple of my friends and I know what I saw, and they'd tell me they've had a couple of Bigfoot run-ins here and there, but never anything like what I described. What happened to me traumatized me. I don't wish this experience upon anyone, not even my worst enemy. In fact, I'm not even comfortable telling the name of the lake due to people going there and seeing for themselves for them to only get captured by whatever it was trying to get me. But I will tell you it was somewhere in the south. This is a larger lake in a little bit more known area. However, we had gone during the off-season. I was 16 at the time and decided I would go with my girlfriend and a couple of her friends. We got to the lake at around 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and I didn't see a whole lot of other people around, other than just us. We got into our swimming suits, and we jumped into the water and had fun. We actually swam out a little ways, I would say at least 100 feet away from shore. I'm a pretty experienced diver. Not diving in the ocean, I mean jumping into pools and swimming. I also do love diving into lakes though, if I have the right equipment. This day though, I just had goggles on, but I was curious to see what I could swim down and see. My girlfriend and her girls were floating and swimming while I did a quick dive. I submerged myself and got probably close to 20 feet underneath the surface. It was mostly murky as expected, and so I decided to propel myself forward, downward before the oxygen in my lungs would pull me back to the surface. Just as I was losing the last little bit of light from the surface, I see this horrible looking face staring at me from about 5 feet away in the water. I immediately stop and propel my body backwards in reaction to try and get away from whatever this thing was. The worst thing you can do in any situation in the water is panic, and I was in a full-blown panic. I immediately tried to propel myself upward to the surface. As I'm pulling myself up, I look down and see whatever this was swimming after me, reaching out to try and grab my leg. This thing had arms and hands just like a person does. It kind of looked similar to the creature of the Black Lagoon, where it had scaly lizard-like amphibian hands and arms. I watched this thing swim up to underneath me and try to grab my leg, but I ended up breaking surface and pulled my head up to get air. I started swimming as fast as I could back to shore. My girlfriend and her friends didn't know what was going on and gave confused and panic-stricken looks. Not even 10 feet away from where I came up to the surface, this thing grabs onto my ankle and tries to pull me back down. I managed to use my other leg and kick its hand off as hard as I could to get it off my ankle, and I re-emerged to the surface once again. I'm screaming bloody murder and asking for help. My girlfriend is already near me trying to help the situation and is able to help propel me to the shore. Her and I ended up getting to shore a couple moments later. She was terrified and was wondering what the hell happened. She saw that I was pale and practically out of breath. I was hyperventilating and having a hard time explaining to her what was going on. I told her that something had grabbed me under the water, and then I saw it. It left a huge red hand mark on my ankle where it tried to grab me. It burned like a chemical burn. She saw it herself and gasped. Her friends were already coming back on the shore wondering what was going on, and they too saw the hand mark on my leg. I think that all freaked us out pretty badly, and so we cut our swimming short that day. I don't know what the hell it was, but it looked like some sort of aquatic monster fish thing. It did look humanoid. I remember it having yellow, lizard-like eyes, but I did not see any teeth that I could remember. I didn't know that things like this existed, let alone lived in lakes. I still get nightmares about this occurrence and have since stopped swimming altogether because this event just ruined it for me. Okay, so this is actually going to be 2 stories for you. Here's the first. Back in the 70s, my father used to do some on-hands engineering work for different branches of government and military. He's worked on numerous secret projects and has done various things. He's told me a lot of stories growing up about some of the stuff he's done, but much of it he hasn't been able to tell due to many NDAs he's had to sign. There is one interesting account that he relayed to me that I would like to share with you. My father is pretty old, so he's starting to share things with me now that he wasn't before. He always tells me he doesn't think he has much time left, so he wants me to know what went on, at least to an extent. Back in the mid-70s, my father worked on a special project that the government was working on, involving several submarines and going into the Great Lakes. Apparently, they have an underground base that's along one of the lakes. I believe it's Lake Michigan, if I remember correctly. Here is where he would work on these submarines, and even worked in them as they were deployed into the lake. He tells me he was never told exactly what they were looking for, but for around 6 years, they were doing a deep exploration project and on the hunt for something near the bottom. Again, he wasn't sure what. It sounded like they were trying to find a possible vessel or something of the likes. He told me at the time that he worked hand in hand with some other highly advanced engineers to build a state-of-the-art special sonar detection system. One of his duties was to be on board during each departure and monitor and ensure the sonar machinery was functioning properly. Here's where things get interesting. The lake doesn't get super deep. If I recall, around 250 to 280 meters is about where it caps off. My father tells me that they were around roughly 220 meters deep at the time, and something really large had popped up on their sonar machinery. This was back in the 70s, so it wasn't anything as advanced as we have today. My father also had built other machinery to be able to distinguish based on other data whether something was an object, organic matter, or a living organism, like a fish, etc. This thing approached the submarine closer and closer, and it ended up showing bigger and bigger on the sonar. My dad became really nervous because everything pointed to it being an organism, but nothing lives down at the bottom of the lake that could possibly be this large. His supervisor thought it was potentially an enemy vessel, but my father told him the metrics and sonar told a different story. Whatever this thing was so large, as it swam past the sub, its sheer force going through the water knocked the submarine off course and almost sent it spiraling to the bottom. The submarine nearly did a somersault in the water and practically nosedived. The crew and everybody aboard was freaking out, but once they regained their position, everything seemed to steady. Nobody really talked about what it could have been, and everybody just kept on course with their mission. I would like to state that the submarine they were on wasn't a typical military submarine like what you would see in the movies. It was roughly half the size, and probably only held 20 to 30 people. My father tells me it scared the living shit out of him, and made him really hesitant on future expeditions. He says he doesn't know if it was a large fish or what it was, but he knows it was huge. He said, judging by the metrics and the sonar readings, it was at least 3 times the size of a blue whale. We're talking something that's around 200 feet in length compared to a submarine, which was roughly around 50 feet. He said he wasn't totally surprised though, because something large like that could be living at the bottom of such a huge body of water, especially if there are underground inlets to the ocean and other lakes like the military claims that there is. He said while working, he was also informed of certain underground channels that could be taken from lake to lake, as well as out to the ocean, but he never actually saw them himself, so he said all in all, it was very possible. Either way, it's absolutely terrifying and makes me never want to go out to a lake. Hi, What Lurks Beneath. This is another story in continuation of the last one I just sent you. You know, the one where my dad worked as an engineer in the 70s into the early 80s for the military and government on various secret projects. As you know from what I told you in the last one, he did a lot of secret stuff, and he is just now telling me due to his old age and him knowing he doesn't have long to live. One of the other projects that he related to me was about an interesting corpse of what they believed to be a Kronosaurus, or some sort of very large prehistoric crocodile had washed up on the shores of Maine back in the early 80s, sometime in January, I believe I was told. My father, who was working on base in an undisclosed location in Maine, got to see this thing firsthand. He couldn't really go into detail what some of his duties were along the coast and what he was doing, but him and his crew that oversaw this ran into a freshly washed up corpse. He said this thing was massive and only a day or two decomposed. He had to extract multiple DNA and tissue samples for further lab analysis, and judging by the appearance, it looked like it could have very well been a Kronosaurus. But he said it had much more reptilian features that made him believe it could have been a possible prehistoric crocodile of some sorts. He said to me it was disturbing that this marine animal had features of both fish and reptilian. This is where things get a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole. He couldn't tell me exactly what, even though he's going to die soon. I guess there's still some information that he says is too sensitive to share. But he did let me in on the fact that there have been a multitude of DNA splicing and testing on creating new creatures and releasing them into the wild as an experiment. They would release multitudes of different animals into the wild to see how well they would survive and thrive in the ecosystem. This involved harvesting DNA from live subjects, as well as fossilized subjects, and then using those DNA to combine and create a new animal. He said a lot of the times where DNA wouldn't fit together, they would borrow human DNA coding or other similar animal DNA coding to fill in the blanks to make their own hybrid. He said they actually ran a marine DNA project down there in the early 80s. He said due to the freshness of this corpse that had washed up, he told me he wouldn't be surprised if it was from the program, that maybe they were splicing dinosaur DNA with reptilian DNA. He also said it's very possible that this thing was just living in the ocean and could have washed up on shore and they happened to get to it first. The area of the coastline where it was found at was pretty remote, so it's not like tourists were anywhere around to see this. He said this Kronosaurus-like animal was at least the size of a whale and had massive razor teeth. He said he saw this kind of stuff more often than you think, and it didn't really bother him all that much, although he did claim how interesting it was. He said the last encounter where the huge fish swam by their sub and knocked them down was much more terrifying. He later retired from doing secret projects like that in about 83 or 84. I'll do my best to try and get more stories out of him so we can share it with your viewers, as I believe they would love to hear this kind of stuff. This story takes place in summer of 2018. It was late at night, and me and my friend Matthew were swimming at the lake. Now, I am a rather large guy for my age. I'm 15 and I'm about 6'5", and Matthew is 16 and is about 6'2". I was swimming for about an hour before I had to use the bathroom, so I took my flashlight and headed toward the community bathrooms. The bathrooms are always open on the account that the path by the lake was commonly jogged at night, but not tonight. I brushed it off as we were here later than we had been before. After doing my business, I started to head back, but I saw something in the path. Me, thinking it was Matthew, yelled out, "Hey Matthew, over here." I walked closer, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I heard in a voice almost identical to mine say, "Hey Matthew, over here." It sounded like whatever this thing was, it was trying to mimic me. I shined my light in its direction and I saw a large, bone-thin figure with long arms and a deer head. Well, almost a deer head. It looked off. It said again, "Hey Matthew, over here." I stood there for what felt like hours, but could have only been 2 minutes before I heard Matthew from behind. I looked back at the thing and saw it bolt for the woods, which was about 60 feet away, but whatever it was made it in only about 2 seconds. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned around to see Matthew. He asked why I was in so much pain and shaken. He told me that he had heard me call his name 3 times, but I had only said it once. After I got home, I looked up and what I had seen, and the only thing that matches the thing was a Skinwalker. I still go to that lake with Matthew, and the other night, but I always carry my gun with me, just in case. To this day, I haven't told anyone the story. My loved ones all think that I had a decompression accident during a routine diving trip, but that couldn't be any further from the truth. I guess I should give you a little background before getting into the meat of the story. I don't dive anymore, but back when I was a Mormon Scouts, it was basically all I did. We even had the same inside joke where they would call me Holy Diver, in the reference to the 1983 Dio song of the same name. It's not like I was being bullied or anything. I quite like the name and the song as well, since I still listen to it regularly to this day. Well, to get to the point, I had convinced our scoutmaster that we should go camping near the shore of the Great Salt Lake, and even though he many times said no, saying would be too dangerous, he eventually buckled under the condition that I was not allowed to dive. At the time, I had no idea what could be so dangerous about that lake, but now I think I know better than anyone. The bus ride to the campsite was uneventful, save for my best friend at the time throwing up. We all had a good laugh about it, but he seemed to be in genuine pain, so we apologized for laughing, and he had to be picked up by his mom's boyfriend, since his mom didn't have a driver's license and his dad was at work in the tire factory. To this day, I still think about how he was the luckier one of the two of us, despite it not seeming like that was the case at the time. I mentioned earlier that my scoutmaster made me promise I wouldn't dive on the trip. As you may be able to guess, I didn't need his advice. I had smuggled all of my diving gear with me in my big brother's sports bag, which was bigger than my sports bag, and thus was the only one that could carry all of my gear. To this day, I still don't know why Scoutmaster Evan was so afraid of going into the lake. Maybe he knew something lurked down there, but didn't have the courage to tell anyone. That's definitely a feeling I can relate to. I never got to ask him because he died violently not long after the story. It was in the middle of the night, and everyone else had gone to sleep. Since I had brought my diving light, the darkness didn't serve a problem to me. I snuck out to the shore and geared up. I can still remember the dark reflection of my wet-suited teenage body in the water side to this day. Somehow I felt like I had done something wrong, like I had sinned by breaking my promise to Scoutmaster Evan, but I had come so far, so I decided to jump in anyway. It was beautiful down there, and to this day, I still believe that's why the monster inhabited these waters. Even inside the cruelest beasts, there must be some semblance of beauty, as is true for all of God's creatures. At least, that's what I tell myself. I was examining a cool rock when suddenly I felt pressure on my back. My first thought was, this must be some kind of sea turtle. I realize now how silly that was, since sea turtles don't live in lakes, first of all, and second of all, because I suddenly felt claws. I didn't get a good look at it, but I saw scales and bright red eyes, almost like a demon. I don't know any naturally occurring animals with red eyes, leading me to believe that that's what it was. Maybe it was a punishment for my sins. Maybe I was just unlucky enough to be one in its territory during lunchtime, and all I know is I was lucky to get out of there alive. And to this day, I still thank God for every single day. I slammed my light into its face, disorienting it for a second, and then I saw it swim like heck. The waters were dark, but suddenly I saw a light emanating from above. It was Scoutmaster Evan in a rowboat. He had discovered that I was gone and went out to look for me. Knowing the monster wouldn't dare near the surface, I had a second wind and swam faster than I ever had before. I jumped into the boat, blood gushed from the claw wound in my back. I told him I accidentally swam into some rocks, but he didn't believe me. To this day, I don't know if it's just because he knew about the demon or if I was just a bad liar. But back then, I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to shore ASAP. Soon after, I sold all my diving gear except for the clawed wetsuit, and to this day, I haven't dived ever since. About 2 summers ago, my dad and I were fishing at Sturgeon Lake, which is a small lake near our hometown. We were about to start the day fishing and my dad was just pulling the boat up so I could jump in, when there was an extremely large splash about 50 yards away from us near the center of the lake. Now, I can't stress this enough, but this lake isn't particularly big. But occasionally, people do catch large 40 to 50 pound pike out in this lake. So, 15-year-old me tries to think about it logically and labels it as such. Once I get in our boat, my dad starts up the trolling motor and we go over to the far side of the lake. The fishing was great that day and you could pretty much catch any pickerel on every cast, and I had almost forgot about the splash when it happened again, and my dad had seen it this time. So he looked at me with wide eyes and said, "What was that?" I told him it could have been a big pike, but he was sure that whatever made the splash was not that. So, we slowly drifted over there, and not even 2 minutes later, I saw a large silhouette slinking around just under the boat. But the weirdest thing in it had hands. Not human hands, but paddling bass with 3 fingers, kind of like an alligator. I pointed it out, and my dad, he immediately started up the engine. When we had made it back to shore, he had asked me if I had saw what he had saw. And I asked, "The shadow in the water?" And he then replied, "No, that's not what spooked me." So I had asked him, "What was it?" And he said, shaking, "It came out of the water on my side of the boat." Its head was the shape of a saucer, and it had eyes on the top of its head, and a black and rust orange coloration. To this day, we have not returned to the lake because there should be nothing that big in that lake. I've been trying to pinpoint that it could be unlike the name of the lake suggests, since there are no sturgeon there, so that rules sturgeon out. And besides, sturgeon have a pointed head like a shark, and not a round one. The only thing that's come close to maybe it is being a giant salamander. It matches what my dad saw, but I doubt one would be that big, and I think they only get up to 4 feet. And what would one be doing in the middle of a lake? This happened last summer, and I will never forget it. I was up at a lake I don't remember what the name was for the weekend. I stayed at a cabin maybe 100 or so feet from the lake. The first night on a Friday was peaceful. So far I thought. I was texting my best friend on Hangouts, and that's when I heard a scream. Of maybe a teenage girl coming from the lake. That ticked me off because it was late at night. I woke up later at about 1 a.m. to the sounds of hands slapping my window. I got up armed with my rifle, but when I went to the window, There was nothing there, and yet there were handprints on the window. Then there was a knock on my door, and I felt a cold breath on my neck. "Behind you," a voice had said. I looked behind me only to see a ghost face of a teenage girl who let out the same scream. I heard it every hour that seemed to come from the lake. I put my iPhone to record the lake, and that's when I found something horrifying. The ghost spirit, or whatever it was rising out of the lake. It was probably 7 feet tall. It had seemingly nice clothes though, and that's when I googled this strange occurrence. Apparently, a few years ago, a girl was stabbed in the head and then thrown into the lake. She screamed out of agony, and her clothes were blue jeans and a red shirt, with dark hair, just as the ghost was. I don't know if I believe this source, and I forgot where it was, but I know for sure I will never go back to that lake again. On a side note, I wonder why my iPhone kept showing pictures of the handprints on the screen. I don't know if these things are connected, but this will be the last time I camp alone. Be safe out there for everyone, and even people who have risen from the dead are still out there to get you. This is a true story that I do not really like to talk about or even think about, but it's been long enough to finally get it off my chest. It's been close to 10 years now since my wife's birthday in August of 2008. So the story goes, me and my wife decided to go night fishing at Lake Mead since it could be very hot in the daytime, especially in August at Lake Mead. So we packed up all of our fishing gear and headed out to Lake Mead for our fun-filled fishing night. Little did we know the horror that we were about to encounter that same night. I remember it clearly as we pulled up to launch and the boat, as it was around 7 p.m. when we arrived, so me and my wife hop in the boat and troll our way to a lucky fishing spot that we have been to before. So we get there, and I anchor the boat, and we immediately started to fish. Hours had went by, and it was a little after midnight when suddenly we hear 4 loud bangs, or should I say pounding, on the bottom of our boat. My wife was so scared I had to calm her down, as I was also freaked out and had no idea what it was. And then we hear splashing about 10 feet away, so I turn on my spotlight and pointed towards the splashing, and then we see a man in a yellow vest splashing in the water. So I yelled, "Are you okay? Hello?" with no response, as my wife is crying and freaking out just to let her know. We were in the middle of the water, nowhere near land with no other boaters around. I yelled at the man one last time, "Are you okay?" And suddenly the splashing stops, and then we can clearly see the man, or thing that had no head, just sitting there now, floating with his hands out of the water, sinking down to the bottom. After this, I started the boat immediately and started to head back to the launch ramp. As I was heading back, we hear a loud scream to the left of us coming from a cove that we were passing. So again, I turned on my spotlight and pointed it to where the noise was coming from. And there he was again, the man in the yellow vest with no head, waving at us. As we saw this, my wife got absolutely hysterical and screaming, and then I knew this was a paranormal situation. I was freaking the hell out. I dropped the throttle and got out of there as fast as possible. When we approached the loading dock, there were other boaters and had noticed my wife freaking out, and they asked if everything was okay. I had to explain to them the situation, and they were also freaked out by my story. My wife has never went fishing again at night. Before I start off my encounter, let me give you a little layout of the area. From my house, there is a 2-mile-long bike path that runs through both of our neighborhoods. If you ride your bike up the path to half a mile, you will find yourself in the middle of a vast open park. And since the trail is facing north, to your left is a beautiful lake known as Sturgeon Lake, Illinois. Well, that's the spot where we had claimed to have encountered it. To this, I never took him seriously, that is, until I had an encounter of my own. You see, we're just in the midst of filming the 3rd episode of Carl's Ghost in the middle of a cornfield that was right next to an abandoned house lot in the middle of the woods, which is located just next to the lake. While making the first cutscene, I noticed at the corner of my eye a humanoid figure on what I believed to be all fours emerged from the empty cornfield and onto the road, just a few yards away from where we were both standing. Keep in mind it was pitch black outside, and when we were making the video, so all I could see was the thing walking back into the darkness on the other side of the road, given the fact that its horrific features were exposed under the streetlight. Alarm bells in my head went off, and to my horror, I told Ryan that there was something crossing the road right behind us and that we needed to get out of there now. He laughed and said that I must be fucking with him, but he eventually saw my ghost white expression on my face, and he agreed that we make one more cutscene and get out of the area as soon as possible. Skip ahead a few days, and as ridiculous as it sounds, I find myself wandering these same woods looking for my sunglasses that I had left behind the previous night. While wandering these woods or the house lot, I had this gut feeling telling me that I wasn't alone, and red flags told me to get the hell out of the area. What I found next shocked me. What I found were bare human prints that looked like someone was walking barefoot, only the toes were ended in claws. Red flags had went up in my head, and that's when the stench of rot and decay hit me harder than a freight train barreling towards me. I came to my senses and realized that I wasn't welcome. My mom and whole family has always bought and sold items on Craigslist for as long as I can remember. Since I was little, I always found that the whole dealing with a stranger on the middle of nowhere deal was the unsafest thing you could do, but free stuff, right? This story proved me wrong. A few years back, my family was in search of a bed frame for cheap. With little to no luck, my mom began to search Craigslist and found one. It seemed to be in decent condition, so she messaged the seller. He seemed off even by his messages. He wanted to meet us at his home in the middle of nowhere. My mother felt unsafe. And her gut feeling, she knew she could not meet up with this man. She declined his offer even though we went down on the price to coax her into coming. And soon after the fact, an older couple from a few cities over went missing. They had went on a road trip to purchase something they found on Craigslist. In a small Georgia town, the same one that my mother almost traveled to meet the man with the bed frame, the couple's body and car was found in a lake near to the man's address. Weeks after they went missing, the man was found and arrested, but it's unnerving to think that this seller and murderer was the same man that tried to coax my mom into coming into his house in the woods. This stranger off Craigslist could have made me a motherless child. I have not been on the site in search of things since, but if you have to meet to purchase something, make sure it's in a public place with witnesses, and you always follow your gut feeling. I want to start this off by saying that I'm 17 years old, in my senior year of high school, and when I tried to tell people this story, nobody has believed me. No one except for my friend Jacob, because he was actually there. My name is Austin, and I've always believed in various cryptids ever since I was young and watched the TV show Lost Tapes. This last summer was full adventures and different experiences, but it was by far the most terrifying summer yet. You see, I spend a lot of time hiking or longboarding at our local park in my hometown in Illinois. Anyone who knows me will know that if I'm not working, I'm at the lake or at home practicing the guitar. I had been working at the town's water park as a lifeguard since I was 15 and had made many friends. But Jacob was the only one I was truly close to. We'd get coffee from time to time or just drive around in the country. But Jacob wanted to hang out afterwards. I had just finished a double shift and I wanted to go to the lake. He agreed, and after work, that's where we went. I asked Jacob if he wanted to go down some of the trails. He answered with a nod. We had finally reached a set of trails I've never been down, and it looked just as cheery as the rest of the trails. No sooner than 30 minutes into the walk, the sun started to go down. Jacob wanted to pursue, and so did I. That was our first mistake. We eventually had gotten down to where we could hear the sounds of the lake. 5 minutes or so later, we were laughing after a joke I had told when we came to a fallen tree and taken a seat. Jacob pulled out a pack of cigarettes and lit one. And just to clarify, Jacob is 20. We sat and enjoyed the silence. Silence, I thought to myself. I spoke up to Jacob. That's weird, it's never this quiet at night. He took a drag off of his cigarette and listened intently. I stood up to stretch and asked him if he wanted to continue down the trail. But before he could answer, Jacob noticed something. Hey, do you see that down there by the edge of the lake? I looked down and I had thought it might have been a lost dog or a deer, because they can be seen regularly out here and I've returned several dogs to their owners before. Before I could say anything, he moved past me and said, Hey, Austin, I think it's an injured dog. So I started following him. When I was walking behind him, I was looking at the ground because we were walking off path, and it was hard to see with it being dark. The next thing I noticed was that Jacob stopped and I walked right into him, sending us both falling to the ground. My glasses and phone fell off my face and out of my hands. When I picked them up, I looked around. Jacob was gone. I stopped in my tracks. That dog that he had thought was there was not a dog. It had a long, distorted body, its legs and arms twisted among themselves. It was skinny and looked like it hadn't eaten in days. It was pale gray with tufts of fur on its arms and legs. The scariest part about this was its eyes. Soulless black eyes. Its mouth had no lips, but its face formed something straight to its sharp, jagged teeth, with a small nose that looked like it had been ripped apart by something. I let out a gasp as I trembled to my feet, not daring to take my eyes off it. It opened its mouth and said my name, and it sounded like Jacob, making an emphasis on the S in my name. I nearly crapped myself. I started walking backwards when I tripped over something, and I fell backwards onto my butt. This thing then stood quickly. It towered over me. My hand gripped a small rock, no bigger than my palm, and without any rational thinking, I threw it at the creature. It didn't even flinch. When the rock bounced off its arm, it almost sounded like it was laughing. It got down on all fours and crept towards me, and that's when I lost it. I turned and ran. As I ran, I could hear this thing crashing and stumbling through the woods. I ran for what seemed like forever, and I could finally see the clearing. Jacob was already in his car and he was revving his engine. Come on, hurry up, let's get the hell out of here. But right as he said that, I tripped over something and was sent rolling out onto the loose gravel. Scrambling to get back up, I heard it saying my name again. I ran around Jacob's car, and before I even got the door shut, we drove off. I looked back, and there, out of where I came from, was that creature, sitting on its knuckles. I closed my eyes and I told Jacob to just go. We drove for 20 minutes. My eyes were closed and I was terrified. The next day I filed a police report and they had sent a few officers out there. A couple days later, after persisting, the police told me to tell me if they found anything. They said the only thing out of the ordinary out there was mutilated, decaying rabbit's body. They told me if I'm so worried about it, I should just avoid going out there. I didn't need to be told that. 3 months have gone by, and Jacob doesn't like to talk about it. I finally lost it and asked what did he see when we went down there. He said when we were walking down there, this thing was sleeping. He described it just like I did, and when I walked into him, he said he fell right in front of the thing, waking it up. That's when he turned and ran. He apologized, but he didn't want anything to happen to him. I couldn't blame him. Jacob's 5'10", no muscle on him at all, and about 120 pounds. He wouldn't have stood a chance. If you're ever in the Midwest state of Illinois, in the Knox County area, stay away from the lake, because you never know what's in the dark waiting for you. First of all, I'm not the best writer, and my grammar is really bad, and this is a short story, but I need to tell more people about what lives in Lake Tahoe. Now, I'm not saying not to go there. It's a beautiful place, but you need to understand that there is an unexplainable thing that happens in this lake. Now, this happened a few years ago, and I went with my family to a trip to Lake Tahoe. We were going swimming and hiking. It was my dad and my cousin and my uncle. We swam for a while, and the water was really cold, so we got out. My uncle had the idea to rent a boat so we can go fishing. I didn't want to because deep water scares me, but I couldn't argue. We brought 3 fishing poles and some nets, and the boat was pretty small, but went fast. We went off. We stopped in a good spot where we can get some fish after a few boring hours I wanted to try. My dad gave me the fishing net. After about 20 minutes, I got tired of holding the net, and as soon as I was going to give the fishing pole back, my uncle caught something big. Now, my uncle is an experienced fisherman and has been fishing since he was roughly 13. Never have I seen him struggle so bad like this. Soon, whatever made my uncle took the fishing pole right from his hands, he was surprised, and we went back, and I started to cry. On the way, my dad and uncle were talking about what it could have been. Soon after that, we had went hiking. Me and my cousin were having the time of our lives, and we were playing with sticks, pretending to be in Star Wars. We saw some huge rocks that you could stand on and see the water below. The water was so deep and full of waves, it was beautiful and scary at the same time. My cousin needed to use the bathroom, so he went with my uncle to find a bush. I looked down at the water one last time, and I almost shit my pants. There was a huge creature swimming towards the rock. I couldn't even move, I just stood there in horror. It was almost the size of a school bus. It looked like a catfish from its head, but with bigger teeth. It had 4 flippers and a long tail like a crocodile that was almost bigger than me. It was covered in black spots, and its skin was gray, mixed with a dark brown, and its belly was a dirty yellow. I saw it had my uncle's fishing pole stuck in its mouth. I was so scared. My dad noticed that I was going to fall, but he ran and caught me. I was stuttering and crying. I just wanted to get out of there. My uncle and cousin came running to see what was happening. I was uncontrollable, and my uncle went to see and stood there shocked, and he saw it too. He said, "What the fuck is that?" And he picked up a stone and threw it at it. The thing swam away. He said, "Let's go back," and we ran towards our car. I was the first one in the car, and we didn't really talk except for my cousin wanting to know what was happening and why we were leaving so early. When we got home, my uncle said to me and my dad what he saw, and I said I saw the same thing. He said he even saw his fishing pole, and I confirmed all of it too. I still go to Lake Tahoe, I just don't swim there anymore. What scares me is that creature could have flipped our boat over and left us helpless in the water, picking us off one by one,